Okay.
Great. Thank you. Hola, Jean-Marie.
Very nice to have you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, so when we keep you on a very tight schedule, sorry you had a very short lunch because the morning session went over time, but I think it was well worth it. This afternoon, the only slight change of program is Hakim Venman, who was expected to moderate from Geneva, actually, has fallen sick. And so Sarah Cliffe has very kindly agreed to be both a speaker and a moderator. And I hope that the role as moderator will not prevent us from hearing from her about a vast experience. You have the bios, and she has a lot to say through a career that has gone through the World Bank, through the Yuan, now leading a very important research center at NYU. We are very happy to have her, as we are very happy to have Ambassador Mohammed, who is the permanent representative of the African Union to the United Nations, and Luis Alberto Moreno, who was for many years the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, who is now an investment banker, but still very much focused on issues of peace building, state building. And so we'll have perspectives really from different corners. And I'll stop there and hand over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. Does everyone hear me well? Very good. So as Jean-Marie said, I had intended just to be giving a small contribution in this panel, but I am now also acting as moderator. So I'd like to welcome Ambassador Mohammed, Luis Alberto Moreno, and Wang, our panelists. We are talking today about a crucial topic of the political economy of state building. And I wanted just to introduce by putting out three basic ideas of what we know about the political economy of state building and state building in general in countries that have been affected by conflicts and have long legacies of conflict. So first of all, we know that it takes a long time. When I was still at the World Bank, we did a study of all the post-conflict transitions in the 20th century, including countries in Europe that had recovered from conflict after World War II, countries like Indonesia that had gone through democratic transition in the 20th century. And the results were very interesting. For countries to move from a level of extreme fragility, round about, say, the level that Haiti now finds itself at, to a level of stable development, countries like Ghana or Indonesia now, on indicators like government capacity, government accountability, the role of military in politics, and other key state building indicators, took between 35 and 40 years. So in general, when people think about this internationally, they often think about processes of transition of 3 years with huge expectations that transformations will be achieved in societies overnight. But that's not, in fact, what we see, in fact. Now, there are arguments that that is increasing, that there are new technologies, new ways to deliver capacity, new ways to channel demand for accountability from citizens. But in fact, we don't have any evidence that it's got faster than it was in the last century. The second thing I would say is that models imposed from outside don't work. So when we look at successful examples of countries that have successfully made those transitions to more stable, higher capacity, more prosperous societies, they have very much innovated in their own models. So typically they have looked at their own models of political governance that reflect their societies, their own models of delivery of services and relationships between state and citizens. And I hope we'll hear from our panel on this question. And the third and last point I'd make is that political economy is crucial here. So we see in many, many country situations that corruption, nepotism, state capture, often fueled by the role of international actors or funds flows, is a crucial issue in undermining state building and the sustainability of post-conflict transition. So looking at those issues as part of processes of preventing and recovering from conflict and of state building is important. I was in February this year in DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country actually that I think in a society is in fact making progress in what has been a transition from an extremely difficult legacy of long-term conflict and colonialism. And yet it's a country that certainly demonstrates all three of those points: the length of time that this takes, that models need to derive from inside, and that political economy is crucial. So we're glad to have a really outstanding panel. I would like to be able to turn around to greet Ambassador Mohammed and Luis Alberto Moreno, but the format is a little difficult. But we're very glad to have the panel with us today. We have Ambassador Fatima Mohammed, who is the permanent observer for the African Union at the UN, Luis Alberto Moreno, former president of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Wang, fellow at the Columbia, Harvard, China, and the World Program. So, Ambassador Mohammed, I'd like to start with you, if I may. As permanent rep of the African Union, it would be important to ask for your reflections on the challenges of state building on the continent and the role of the African Union and the RECs. Do you see a clear approach or doctrine, could we say, of the African Union emerging, including on key issues of legitimacy, capacity, and peer pressure that the African Union can bring? Ambassador Mohammed, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to join you today. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person, but I'm glad we have this new system of being able to do things in a hybrid format. So thanks again for the invitation. I'm also happy to be able to share some reflections with you on this question of state building from an African perspective, and of course the role of the African Union. To be honest with you, when I was asked to speak on the topic initially, I have to admit I had a little bit of difficulty principally, I think, in narrowing the focus on the contributions that I can make for two reasons. One, because when you're speaking from the perspective of a continent or an institution, you're faced with kind of a double challenge, right? One being the sheer diversity of the current state of the various nations within the continent, nations and subregions. But also in terms of presenting a relatively broad perspective of a continental intergovernmental institution, and the rather restricted role, I would say, that an institution such as ours can play in state building. However, there's some, I think, common challenges of state building which allow the AU as a regional organization to play a role in ensuring coherence and, to a certain extent, sustainability. Now, the issues surrounding state building in Africa are numerous and can be seen from various perspectives. As a continent, we're confronted with, for lack of a better word, a double-edged sword, if you like, of, on the one hand, the considerable charge of state building, but on the other hand, the challenge of fragility and all the trials that come with it. And in order for us to understand the role of the African Union, I think it's important for us to understand a little bit of the background of the institution and the evolution of the organization itself. Because as I always say, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from. So without going into too much detail, just allow me to give you a brief background in terms of the evolution so that you'll be able to appreciate better where we are today. So the African Union initially started out as the Organization of African Union, which was established in 1963. And initially, the focus of the founding fathers was the liberation of Africa from its colonial masters and the beginning of independence and the decolonization of African states. And this was fueled principally by the Pan-African movement, which started on this side of the hemisphere, where the movement was pushed by a number of prominent individuals such as Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, and built on the premise that colonialism lay at the heart of Africa's economic, political, and social problems. Now, at that time, the founding fathers of the OAU advocated for the independence of the African continent and the rejection of colonialism and other exploitation. And they also advocated for the unification of Africa through regional blocs, which you mentioned in your introduction, and the adoption of democracy. Now, the OAU at that time made some steps towards identifying some socioeconomic development issues on the continent at that time. But more importantly, it succeeded in supporting the liberation movements and overthrowing colonial regimes and combating racism to a certain extent, eventually apartheid, and resolving some of the boundary disputes that existed among its member states. At that time, the emphasis was more on positive neutrality, if you like, and non-interference. Unfortunately, this later became a major impediment for the organization. Shortly after that, we witnessed a number of emerging dictatorships and coups and counter coups, which also exacerbated political instability. Unfortunately, today, to a certain extent, it's almost like a vicious cycle, and we're currently seeing some of this manifesting in some parts of the continent today. Now, the OAU was eventually dissolved, and the AU was born in 2002. And in 2002, the focus was more on fostering socio-economic development, the enhancement of Africa's role in global affairs, and a shift from non-interference now to non-indifference. Now, it was important to give you this background, as I mentioned, so that you appreciate the important objective of the AU and the role that it plays today. The focus principally being on integration of African states throughout the continent in terms of the pursuit of a vital, I would say, mechanism for political cooperation, and of course, pooling our resources together. And a number of treaties were adopted over this period, and also the creation of our regional economic blocs, which remain the basis of integration, particularly on a sub-regional level, but also the recognition that these regional economic blocs are pillars, building pillars for the African Union today. And these regional economic blocs ensure to a large extent that national governments implement the regional decisions that are primarily driven from the continental frameworks that exist at the level of the African Union. Now, that said, with this background, this brings me to the issue of the challenges, which to a large extent, I think we can generalize. First of all, I must say that today we all recognize that Africa is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. It's also a continent which is rich with numerous natural resources, many of which have had an effect on state building. And many nations and regions within Africa suffer today from what we call the resource curse. Another one of the challenges that we currently face is the issue of state capacity to manage and to deal with crises. I will not go into the various specific crises that we are currently deal with, but I just want to say in general terms that ideally a state should be able to to a good extent, and I think we can all agree on this, impose a certain level of law and order and be able to regulate its economic activity and provide public goods in general. In addition, the issues of political economy, I think, also give rise to the fact that because we have these challenges, we end up with a number of fragile institutions which kind of hamper, or to a certain extent even reverse some of the gains that we've made, and this creates public insecurity and to a large extent also paralyzes economic development. The question is, how can we build more accountable and responsive states? And this comes to your particular question about the issue of legitimacy and what the African Union can bring in terms of pressure. And I just want to mention one of the mechanisms that we actually have in place, which is the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is an instrument that is used to systematically assess and review governance at the head of state peer level. The APRM was founded by the institution as a tool, a necessary tool for African heads of states and government to be able to promote political stability and also accelerate socioeconomic development and growth and integration within the continent. The flip side of this is that member states of the African Union have to agree to be independently reviewed, and their compliance, if you like, with some of the commitments, both continentally and internationally, also has to be reviewed based on their agreement. So maybe for me to conclude on that point, without taking too much time, is to say, in general terms, that state building in Africa, we see state building in Africa and sustainable development as interconnected, and this can be approached through sound domestic policies, strong continental and regional efforts, and through treaties and agreements with partner institutions, both within the region and also globally. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Mohammed. And I think you outlined some issues that are going to be very important for the discussion with our other panelists, including the importance of history and historical legacies when we think about state building, the role of growth and natural resources, which of course should be a boon, but can in fact be a curse when we look at building the capacity and accountability of institutions. Our experience of looking at pathways for very fragile institutions and the ability to become more resilient and more able to provide public goods, law and order and stability, and the role of some of the African Union's instruments in looking at peer pressure on legitimacy, of which your reference to the APRM, I think, is very important for this debate. It might be interesting, Ambassador, I'll come back to you later perhaps on questions about the situation with, in 2021, some unconstitutional changes in government arise in that situation, and the role of other instruments like the Lomé Convention in that regard. But I'd like to turn next to Luis Alberto Moreno, and perhaps ask you first, Luis Alberto, how much does what Fatima just described resonate with you in your experience of Latin America? And then just very briefly, a second question. You, of course, the former president of the Inter-American Development Bank, and this is, as I know well, an issue in which the development banks have tried to enhance their approaches to fragile situations. what do you think here development actors are doing right, and what do you think they're doing wrong? What have they not adapted enough?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much, Ambassador Mohammed, for your comments, which I think, of course, are looking at Africa and Latin America. I often think of Africa like a couple of decades behind Latin America, but many of the things that you described, we went through in Latin America, from the transition of being, the assertion of democracies, of course. That colonial period for us ended over 200 years ago. But equally, it was more the assertion of democracy, which, as imperfect as it is. And of course, the fact that you had largely rural countries that today are, for the most part, urbanized. And that changes the makeup of conflict in many ways. So let me begin at the outset by saying, in all of these post-conflict situations, probably the easiest thing to do is a peace agreement. The more difficult thing to do is to that the elements of that agreement stay over time, because there's always tensions, even to those things that were agreed to, keep in mind. There are really in our hemisphere, the only thing similar to many of the things that Ambassador Mohammed described is the case of Haiti. And Haiti is not a question of a conflict situation as such. Definitely, it is a problem of weak institutions. It is a problem of those institutions being captured by crime and other actors. And the onslaught of so many natural disasters that have plagued Haiti, that basically have put it in a very, very difficult situation. And so there, what you have is, my experience in dealing with this was, in this earthquake that was massive over 10, 12 years ago, there was a huge inflow of development assistance. There were a lot of programs put together. But as always, you get a lot of donor fatigue, and how to address that donor fatigue and how to deal with it. And that fatigue works both for the donors and for the recipient country. And that, of course, went about with changes of government. And it was all about, essentially a form of nation building, because it was about building roads. It was about putting water and sanitation. It was about bringing back up schools. And actually, in the case of Haiti, the numbers of kids going to school went from about 30% to close to 80, 90%. Of course, the quality of the education is still, a big distance in which to aspire. And on the other hand, perhaps the conflict I saw the closest was that of Colombia, which was after 50 years of, and I know Jean-Marie has had President Santos and many of the actors who were involved in this. But the reality is that peace process in Colombia was submitted to a referendum. It lost. That created a big, divide inside the country. And there were a lot of issues that were relitigated even despite the peace process being finalized. But aside from that, the other aspect is investing in many of the areas where much of the conflict and the root causes of the conflict were, which have to be in this case, mostly in rural areas, mostly in lack of government investment in many of those areas, and how to bring the state back into there. And what you always find is that despite my experience was in looking at many of these conflict zones, people at the end of the day want the state to be there. I mean, they don't want criminal actors to be the dominant actors. They want to see the state, and they want to see the state acting, of course. And this is easier said than done. So these are kind of the things that I dealt with a lot to your question in terms of the Inter-American Development Bank. We cannot get involved in defense issues, which are always an important piece, because asserting the security in many of the regions is a must. But once that happens, is how to work and really be able to deploy aid in a very significant way and while building up, working with communities. And this was a lot of what we did in very creative forms, both in the case of Haiti, in Colombia, and in others, to work with development assistance, with donors, with lending, across programs that essentially deal with communities and how to make sure those communities are engaged and involved. And in my view, this is probably one of the most important aspects for success. The other issue is that, unfortunately, Latin America today is one of the regions of the world with the highest crime rates. And part of the reason for those crime rates are basically not only in terms of rule of law, but the solutions are basically local in nature. It is not that you can decree a solution for a country. It begins at the city level. And here, working with mayors became extremely important, from the favelas in Rio to the cases in Salvador to so many. I mean, just to give you an idea, Central America alone, the crime rate and the very high crime rate has a total of about 8% of GDP of those countries. And what I found, and I think we found in the bank over the years, was that in as much as you do a lot of investment on security to secure the zones, if that is not accompanied by a dollar by dollar almost proportion in terms of social investment, the security situation that you ascertain for a moment, you will always find sooner rather than later that you lose kind of that impact. So I would just kind of begin there, and those are some of the headlines that I would perhaps mention for purpose of opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis Abate. I think you started with a point which is very important, which is the perception often that some regions may be ahead of others in historical transition, but the reality, in fact, that we now see very shared challenges. So I think the examples you gave of both Haiti and Colombia show situations that are also present in Africa, in the Middle East, and indeed in Europe, both of countries that have nationwide fragility in institutions, and those like Colombia, which have strong centers, but very weak institutions in the periphery. And as you said, this was one of the challenges in the peace process, that there were areas where the authority of the state and the presence of the state had not been there for decades. And building up that trust over time is difficult. I think you made very important points also about the role of engaging communities and what we have learned on that, on the balance of security and social investments, and on the role of subnational actors and mayors, particularly when we look at things like the challenges post-conflict transition of rising crime rates. So let me come now to Yuan Wang and ask you, Yuan, you specialize in looking at the role of infrastructure in development and some of the external investment questions. How do you see the role of economic investments in state building?
This is a very big question, but it's a very important one. So when I was looking at infrastructure in Africa, I particularly look at how Chinese development finance and Chinese companies contribute to or detriment to the development of host countries. So China started off develop its own development by infrastructure investment. And a lot of its own state-owned enterprises became global 500 major companies because of their domestic contributions to the development in the 1980s. And then they went abroad and to seek overseas market. And the one destination they go is Africa. Also Latin America, but with the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, a lot of companies started to go abroad. And the question is here, are these infrastructure constructions helping host countries' development or not? So if we look at the Chinese constructed railways in East Africa. There is a standard gauge railway in Kenya. Many of you, if you have heard about the news in Africa, you probably have heard about this. And there are a lot of positive things associated with it. For example, the GDP growth. People say that there is at least 1.5% growth of GDP associated with this railway. But at the same time, there are also concerns about debt sustainability. There are concerns about ESG, environment, because Kenya is heavy on tourism. And so a railway that goes across 2 national parks might actually hurt the economy of tourism and also wildlife themselves and social. Chinese companies back in China are not used to working with active civil societies and medias, and now they are coming to Africa and other countries that might have an active civil society and media, and how do they do that? That could also be a challenge and a learning process for Chinese companies. And the governance. Sarah mentioned about corruption can be a detrimental effect for state building. And as we all know, that infrastructure is a notoriously corruptive industry. And so is it possible, even with anti-corruption campaign back in China, a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises' hands are tied. So even with that, is it possible to go into a country that is weakly regulated and could have corruption, and in this industry that is heavily corrupted, to do a clean business? Can they actually do business there? Well, we do see Ethiopia doing this very well. Companies going to Ethiopia, they Chinese, local, and other international multinational companies, they do not engage in corruption as much as their neighboring countries of Kenya. So host country really plays a role here. And whether it is Chinese investment or development finance or other foreign development finance, World Bank, and like USAID, whether this can work for host country is really a matter of whether host country can make it work for themselves. There were a time that people say that China has a policy for Africa, Africa does not have a policy for China. I also wonder, there are 54 countries in Africa, and they really, there's a heterogeneity of institutions, as Ambassador Mohammed mentioned. So is it possible for for countries to learn from each other in their process of dealing with China? And yeah, okay, yeah. So during my research, one main argument I'm working on is the agency of host countries. So when dealing with the second largest country in the world, is it possible for small states in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, has their agency? And what we mean by agency here, a living being has agency, a butterfly has agency against the wind. But what we mean by a state's agency, here we mean that whether it can actually bring foreign investment, foreign businesses agenda to its own development. And we see good examples here, like Ethiopia before its civil war or political crisis, at least. We also see bad examples. I don't want to offend anyone, but Angola could be in the previous regime, in Dos Santos' time, there could be a lot of corruption, state capture, in the sense of using Chinese state or foreign state money coming, feeding into the Dos Santos family in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Yuan. And you focused on 2 points that I'm actually going to use as my last themes before we go to a question and answer session. So the first point that you focused on is the role of corruption and state capture and the links between some forms of economic development and the risks of an increase in corruption and state capture. And the second point you laid out very interestingly is the opportunities and the challenges of investment from a major external power such as China, and the question of how host countries and continents, but host countries is where the agency lies, can best use those for their own development purposes and avoid the possible risks that can undermine. So I'm going to start with the corruption theme and then go to the theme of rivalries and the role of external investors who bring different models. Luis Alberto, can I go to you first? Can you just reflect on the role of corruption and capture, illicit financing flows in retarding state building or providing challenges to state building?
Look, first of all, let me just comment a little bit on what as she just said in terms of China and China's development efforts in Latin America. China became a shareholder of the IDB over 10 years ago. And one of the things I tried very hard was to have Chinese financial instruments to support with all of the safeguards that all our institutions who have, come from the days of Bretton Woods in terms of environmental and social and governance safeguards. And we were very successful in using funding from the Chinese People's Bank of China in creating a co-financing line that essentially piggybacked on a number of projects that we had that had all of these kinds of safeguards. However, the bulk of what China has done in Latin America was basically directly government to government. And let me explain the differences here. You can become very political around this, but I just want to show the differences and how much they matter. The projects that China finances directly are government to government projects. Those government to government projects, of course, the bidding process is entirely different. The financing packages are very different. And in many occasions, I think as China was learning to deal in Latin America, there were projects that were like any infrastructure project, which were the bulk. Some were good and some were not as good. And you see projects like the metro system of the city of Bogota that was basically won by a Chinese company, but the financing came from the European Investment Bank, from the World Bank, and from the IDB, who basically led that consortium. That is a very different project in terms of accountability as opposed to that government to government project. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of learning that needs to take place. Certainly, that modality has been the bulk of what China has done in Africa. And if you look at Latin America, the Chinese Development Bank, its biggest efforts were done in countries like Venezuela, where it by far is the largest creditor of the Chinese Development Bank, way above anything else. So I just preface that because I think that's an important aspect to have in mind. That doesn't mean that everything else is perfect. We have perhaps the most visible case, the highest case known, I think, in many, many years of corruption, which was Odebrecht. And Odebrecht certainly did win a number of bids. And what was found, because they are listed in the US stock markets and automatically are responsible of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They disclaimed that they had done bribes to the tune of close to $1 billion. I forget the exact amount, but it was close to $1 billion in over 12 countries. And that, of course, is that created a very, very difficult situation from an extreme where you had, in the case of Peru, a number of heads of state accused, and actually some had to resign, others were indicted, to a large number of investigations that occurred and continue to occur as a result of that. And certainly, there is no worse thing for any democracy in terms of the loss of trust than corruption. Because I think the minute that societies start to lose trust to their governments and amongst themselves, the value of citizenship, it's immediately gets a big hit. And reconstituting that is one of the most difficult challenges for a working democracy in the modern world that we're in. So if you look at the political campaigns anywhere in Latin America that you see today, the number one thing that people are talking about is corruption. In my own country, in Colombia, there will be an election. We have a ballotage system, so this is the second round. What's driving those two candidates and what they were able to capture voters in Colombia was not because they were going to deal better or worse with the economic circumstances, it's because they appealed to basically not only get rid of all incumbents, but more importantly around corruption, especially around one candidate that's only talked about corruption. And I think corruption has existed with the history of humanity. The question is, I think today more than ever, we have the tools, especially with digital tools, to be able to get deeper in understanding when that corruption occurs. And there's many ways to do this, with uses of blockchain, of artificial intelligence. There's many ways today to do this, and it of course requires a very deep modernization of the systems of procurement of governments that, as we all know, those and electoral systems normally don't go at the pace of development of other parts of the government.
Thank you, Luis Alberto. I think that this point you make about corruption and loss of trust is crucial. And it's interesting, in fact, that in the protests globally during the pandemic, during COVID-19, corruption was the number one issue fueling protests across all societies. So it wasn't, even though there were significant grievances about access to vaccines and medical technologies, but in fact, the number one theme of protests was corruption. This is obviously also a universal issue across regions. So it's a major issue in Europe, in the Americas broadly, including the US and Canada, in Africa and in the Middle East. Ambassador Mohammed, Fatima, if I may, can I turn to you first on this issue? How do you view actions, including those the AU has supported, on illicit financing flows and corruption as being one of the risks in state building? And then I'll come back before the Q&A to ask about a little about the economic rivalries and different models brought by different foreign powers. Ambassador Mohammed.
Well, thank you. Thank you once again. It's been quite interesting to listen to the other panelists, and especially to hear kind of like the common thread in terms of some of the challenges that we have across regions. So in terms of the point you raised on corruption, and I'll use the two words, both corruption and extortion, because I think very often we kind of talk about the issue of corruption without necessarily recognizing the issue of extortion, which tends to be on a minor scale compared to corruption, and I'll explain. We have certain systems or societies where there's so much extortion that happens on a small scale, where you're probably coming to, I don't know, something as simple as at an airport, and you're meeting with customs officials, and they're trying to extort small amounts of money from you. Police checkpoints, particularly in certain developing countries, where they're trying to extort from you. And what you tend to hear is this whole issue about, oh, oh, you know, this society is so corrupt, the system is so corrupt, maybe even government officials that are extorting small amounts of money in order to just do their jobs. And very often I make this argument about how we have to look at this issue a little more broadly. Because when we talk about corruption, it is in a much larger scale. It tends to be much more sophisticated, and very often it's not as obvious as extortion is. So I think it's important that we make this distinction, and I'm speaking particularly from the perspective of African countries. Then the second layer, obviously, is the issue of corruption, which is much broader, and this brings in the point about, you know, IFS. And I must say that it's a big issue for us in Africa. We have an estimated 85 billion per annum in terms of IFS from Africa. If you translate that to the potential of development that Africa is actually losing, I think in looking at the numbers and the data and seeing the reality of a lot of what is happening in terms of countries being distracted in focusing on stabilizing their countries or fighting insecurity and not being able to focus on development, and this whole argument that we have in terms of the interconnectedness. And I think one of the panelists mentioned that the interconnectedness of insecurity or security and development, and the dependency of one over the other, it's kind of like a fuel in itself. And what we've tried to do is, on the one hand, we obviously recognize the issue. It's broader in terms of laundering, it's financing of terrorism, it's the proliferation of financing that's linked to fiscal governance systems, if you like. And of course, this whole issue of how we can work with our partners in terms of the return of stolen funds and even items on the continent. So we're working with a number of partners to ensure that there is more transparency, particularly in terms of corporate tax, and also cooperating with a number of organizations to ensure that we develop and consolidate some sort of capability to fight IFS. I'd like to also, without taking too much time, come back to your point about the unconstitutional changes of government. You mentioned it earlier, but I just wanted to address that very, very quickly. And you also mentioned the Lomé Declaration. So if I may, I'd just like to make a quick point on that, because it is very important for us. And one of the reasons I wasn't even able to join you in person today was because I had to be in another meeting during the travel time to discuss this particular point and some of the initiatives we're putting in place with the UN currently. So I can categorically say that the issue of unconstitutional changes of government, we recognize it as an issue that deepens the socioeconomic and, of course, the political challenges on the continent. And this has, of course, a broad number of negative consequences, particularly for peace and security, which obviously has an impact on state building. But unfortunately, the instability is also used as an excuse by many for lack of a better word, the coup d'etats that we've seen happening in a number of countries. And unfortunately, this has kind of brought us back. And I mentioned earlier in my point about the cycle, right, where we've made a number of some progress and there's been some development, but it has also brought us back in terms of the efforts that we've made over the years, both on the continent and also sub-regionally. The good side is that we have the institutions now in place that are working towards addressing these issues. And the question now is whether they're fit for purpose and whether we can actually address these issues in a sustainable way. But as I mentioned earlier, the issue of interconnectivity and interdependence and how one affects the other is something that is high on the agenda. We've also adopted a number of policy instruments and frameworks, which loan iteration, which you mentioned, and our peace and security architecture, which includes the African Union Peace and Security Council, and of course our Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. But these are tools that we have to kind of address, and we're kind of being put to the test now, right, in terms of whether these tools are fit for purpose. But I want to re-emphasize before concluding that, you know, I had mentioned the underlying causes, and I think these issues obviously heighten insecurity and continue to feed into the political instability, and unfortunately provide the excuses or the havens for those that make the excuse to take over unconstitutionally for terrorists and extremist groups. And unfortunately, it feeds into a vicious cycle, which is of utmost concern. And we have tried our possible best and continue to do so to use these various mechanisms that we have in place to try and address it. But I think addressing the issue has to be done in such a way that is focused towards the future and ensuring that you include all the various stakeholders, which includes civil society, youth, and women, of course.
Very, very important, Ambassador. Thank you for that. And I think that you're right in highlighting the complexity of the causes of some of those situations and the way, in fact, that they also relate to the topic of this panel in terms of not just being political challenges, but often also having political economy issues that are linked as triggers for why some of those unconstitutional changes happened when they did. And I appreciate very much your points about the instruments and facing now this testing period of are they fit for purpose? Are they enough to carry forward? Can I do with all our panelists just one last quick fire round before I go to questions and answers, but I'll ask you to be very brief. Just focusing on this issue of economic rivalries and contestation from outside investments. Yuan picked up on this theme in her comments. And just thinking quickly about two elements of that. First, how to manage that contestation to the advantage of the host countries and region so that they extract the development gains from investment, whether that investment be from China, from the US, from Russia, from the European Union, or from other regions. And the second, the pros and cons of how those different major powers investing in the regions are bringing different models of state-society relations. Ambassador Mohammed, I'm sorry to go back to you immediately, but could I just ask you to very quickly comment on that to start off this last round, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Okay, thank you for that. It's a tough one talking from the perspective of an institution, I think. You know, we are an institution with 55 member states and territories, but each of these nations remain sovereign, and sovereign in terms of their engagements, their partnerships, and how you know, they choose to do development and how they choose to address even their crises. And with the current state of affairs in many of our regions and countries, you've seen that evolving in terms of the kind of partnerships, whether there are traditional partners or non-traditional partners. It's really a sovereign kind of issue. But I think in a very broad sense, I will start by, I can just say, and I think I said that to a certain extent in the beginning, that for our development, we require entering into partnerships, not only within the continent and within regions, but also internationally with a various number of actors in order for us to enhance and benefit for the transformation of the continent. And our relationship as a continent with the rest of the world is really based on, you know, mutual understanding, where we're allowed to respond to our needs through some level of ownership, and obviously with the support of partnerships within the context of multilateralism, which is something that we truly believe in. And as a commission and as an institution, what we try to do is ensure that Africa's interests are taken into account whenever we are engaging with our partners. And this offers opportunities for trade, for investment, and even for peace and security for our people. And this is all within the framework of our development programs, Agenda 2063. So it is vital for us to engage constructively, but also to ensure that we collaborate in a way that is useful and not harmful to the continent. So that's what I can say from an institutional perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yuan, I want to go back to you on this topic, and you also wanted to say a couple of points on the corruption question, I think, and then I'll leave the last word before Q&A from our audience to Luis Alberto.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I could start with the corruption. I have 2 points to make here very quick. So the first is, as Luis just said, corruption is bad. Or maybe the panel pretty much agrees on that. But I want to challenge this: is corruption necessarily bad? I would refer a book which is by a sinologist, Yuan. She studies corruption in China, or more of a developmental states of East Asia, and these countries, Japan, South Korea, China, in their most fastest development stage, it is because of the connection between private sector and government sector. And so it is important, as Ambassador Mohammed said, to distinguish corruption of petty corruption and grand corruption. It's also important to distinguish corruption in terms of corruption to gain access and corruption for private gain or state capture. And corruption to gain access, according to Yuan, a professor, is good. And that is how developmental states in East Asia got succeeded. And corruption, as Sarah just mentioned, happens here and happens in China and elsewhere in developed countries. It's just something that comes with human nature. And so how countries, it's just almost impossible to eradicate it. So what we should do is not to aim for the eradication of corruption, but more for increasing, probably not increasing, but tolerate the access, corruption for access, but less for state capture. If people have point on that, I'm very happy to discuss. And also, corruption is, there are also gray areas, illicit financial flow, right? There are Cayman Islands, there are British Virgin Island, financial centers, offshore financial flows. And Panama paper and Luanda leaks makes it especially clear that behind these illicit financial flows, there are KPMG and McKinsey behind them, right? So probably something we could do is just to address these targets. I mean, companies that they should limit, like institutions that could limit what these big companies can do in facilitating African or illicit financial flow.
Thank you, Yuan. Let me just go directly, because I think that those points are very crucial, just to Luis Alberto, and I'm sure in the questions we'll come back to the issue of contestation and different models of investment. Luis Alberto, so the view on whether corruption greases the wheels. So this absolutely was a view prevalent in East Asia for some period, that this was a foundation in some way of the developmental state. I have to say, Yuan, I think that view was very strongly challenged. You had, for instance, the end of the dictatorship in Indonesia, where the rallying cry of those who were calling for reform was korupsi, kolusi, nepotism, corruption, collusion, and nepotism. And it was really the foundation of grievance for accountability. But this is a very vibrant debate, and I'm interested to see it being raised again. Luis Alberto, did you have last comments on this before we go to the audience?
Look, this would require probably another panel, because clearly, you know, there is so many angles to this point. Just to give you an example, in the United States, you could argue that lobbying is corruption. You can go visit any member of Congress of the United States, and you can look in a webpage and you know exactly who has contributed to his campaigns. So the issue in that case is more about transparency. And if you have that transparency and people know it, that they know how it is, American voters constantly are voting against this sense of the so-called swamp. But it's there, it's open. What I think is a problem is the fact that you don't have that transparency in terms of what you call the greasing of the wheels. And when you don't have that transparency, the excesses that happen are huge. And therefore, that trust that I was mentioning earlier, people perceive not just that one or two made a lot of money, but that the system as a whole, it is built around those that have privileges in deteriorating the life of those that do not. And as a result, you are essentially breaking the foundation of what a working democracy is. So this is a very, very deep issue. And, you know, we could get all kinds of statistics. There's all kinds of efforts done around the, you know, the corporate world. I think if you recall, prior to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you had the cases of Boeing and others. I mean, I think thanks to that Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you went a very long way. You don't have anything close to that in China, let alone in Asia. And I think that's a problem. And that's been a problem in the way China engages in the typology of projects that it deploys in Latin America. That's why I was giving the example at the beginning of why doing it through multilateral institutions with the kinds of rules that basically make transparent the environmental, the social, and the governance issues. But going back to the basic question, I think, you know, this is not only the fault of the donor country, it is a question of alignment. How do you align what a country needs, in this case, the donor recipient, and what the donor is doing? And once you have that clear alignment, what things normally have a problem with is in the execution of those projects. And that's to the detriment many times of the donor recipient, which is not organized within its government to have the capacity to follow up on the whatever project or the donor decided to contribute to. And that's where we get a lot of misalignment. So I think it is in that micromanagement of those processes that you can see success and or failure.
Thank you so much. I think your point with the analogy of lobbying here leads me to give just a testimony to one of the developments that the African region has led, actually, which is to think about some of this in terms, not as Fatima said, of necessarily petty extortion, but in terms of the much more sophisticated systems of state capture, of course, as we see in South Africa with the Zondo Commission and some of the discussions of that. And that can, of course, include both legal and illegal forms. So it's really a question about whether private sector interests or the interests of particular individuals are able to supersede interests of the majority of the citizens of a state. And sometimes that's through illegal forms of corruption or illicit financing flow. Sometimes it may be through legal forms, as in the lobbying example. I'm going to open for questions. I know that this really would be a panel that we could go on for a lot longer exchanging on these subjects, but let us take some questions from the floor. Please go ahead. If you can just introduce yourself. I think, can someone give a mic? Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the panelists for this very insightful discussion. My name is Henry Berghard. I work for the UN mission in Colombia. Actually, Dr. Wang sort of stole some of my intervention. I wanted to do a counter example exactly, and sort of say that corruption is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm thinking of examples in, though I'm not very specifically into the details, about Korea, for instance, that has had a thriving economy, and recently the president was put in jail. She was the daughter of the previous president, so we see an oligarchy and a very efficient economic system. I could think also in Colombia when Odebrecht, the scandal led to the failure of a number of companies that could have developed the country. I worked in Putumayo, and the main highway, you know, the money had been allocated for its development, and it never, you know, became. It was never built because the company failed. So Odebrecht, in a sense, was not necessarily so disturbing, and could have even brought good things to the country. So basically, and also maybe one more point is
Could
that
I just ask you to wind up, just so others have the
yeah,
chance?
no, so that this issue of corruption, for instance, in Colombia, the candidates fighting corruption is actually has a process underway. So you know, how credible is that? But so the point is, if it's not corruption, then what is preventing the development and the thriving of the economy, and how can we affect this development?
Can I take some other questions, if that's fine with the panelists, and then we'll come back to respond to several at once. Can I take the lady over here? Thank you. Thank you very much. If you could introduce yourself also.
Thank you and good afternoon. Mine is not more a question, but almost a comment. My name is Sayonara, and I'm from Angola. UN mission, Angolan mission to the UN. And I don't act like member states, no, for sure not. Just to emphasize that I fully agree that there is a lot of studies regarding with the corruption. But on my point of view, just corruption is corruption, good or bad, and with the different sides is corruption. And this distinction between corruption and extortion, I think is a good way to maybe to just make a platform to move on and try to make another kind of definition. We have to respect studies and research. And another issue is, for sure, governments have to protect and work regarding what you have according to your states, and we have to emphasize that Angola government have been doing a good job from now, and also working on this issue. And we have been in a good cooperation with China, yes. We had bad moments, yes, but we can assure and we can emphasize that from now on, things are much better, and I think we are going to succeed. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Can I come over here, the table at the front? Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Devana de la Puente, and I'm also working with the UN Verification Mission in Colombia. I had just two quick questions. One, it's around foreign investment and what could be the role of regional organizations to balance. And I like what the ambassador says about moving away from the non-interference to the non-indifference concept. And what we have seen many times, for example, in the case when I was working in Myanmar, that they moved too quick to lift the sanctions, the European Union, because it was a competitive environment and the Chinese companies were coming to Myanmar much quicker, and the European Union needed to move their companies. So they lift the sanctions for what many human rights organizations felt it was too quickly, and we see the consequences now. And then, even with the Colombian peace process, although it had a good time, but also now in which environment the companies are operating, even if the human rights conditions in some places are not the best, and what could be the role of the regional organizations there to set some standards. So we move into this concept of non-indifference. And lastly, on illegal economies, I think, for example, especially for Latin America, I mean, the legal economies right now probably move much more money and revenue than anywhere else. And I think they have even formed nowadays like a multinational. I mean, we have the cartels from Mexico, they're all the way up to the Patagonia, and the same with the Venezuelan cartels. And I think that they have been more innovative than even the state itself to counter this. So what could be the role, such as the Interdevelopment Bank, to support this moving for communities or countries to see legal economies replacement to this illegal economy? Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Iason Kaselakis from the Greek mission to the UN. And it was a very mind-blowing discussion here because I think we touched upon matters that we could discuss for hours and hours, and that they are actually interlinked with the very essence of conflict and what fuels conflict and how conflict fuels into the political economy. I'm building on Devana's question as well, and I would like to go a bit further from corruption and to see how our panelists, and thank you very much for your interventions, view conditionality, because I think that the development aid is also fitting into the political economy of the regions at stake and the cycles. And there is this whole debate of conditionality, and there are countries that are less prone to put conditions, certain conditions, and other countries or regional organizations that are more prone. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. Question over on the left at the back. And then I'll have one last question in the middle, and I'll have to go back to the panel.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tishbek Majoki from the EU delegation. I would like, first of all, to thank all, and also to remind that the EU has a trilateral relation with the African Union and the UN. I'm very happy because I worked on this a little bit. So I just wanted to ask two questions. The first one is, and building on what my predecessor speaker said, corruption is related also to how we address conditionality is one. I'm working on the human rights section. So I just wanted to ask how business and human rights are interlinked into this narrative and discourse we have today. The second thing is about SDGs, how you see, because you have the Agenda 2063, and how you see that building in Africa. And finally, a more difficult question, I think, is how do you see the African Union structure delivering today in front of all these challenges, and what about craft the sanction regime as well? Thank you.
So those are also very questions that would require, I think, probably longer than we have left in the session, but we will come to them. I'm going to like just two very quick questions, if I may, one on this table and one here on this table, please.
Hi, my name is Charles Maonyega. I work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ghana. I think mine is more of a comment. So with my little observation, I think it has to do with corruption, but I would say everything rises and falls on leadership. So if you have a leader who comes into power in an illegitimate way, that alone should tell you what is going to happen. Then now you have nepotism. Then you have being non-accountable. And then also when it gets to the rule of law, because they came into power in that way, then they have influence as well. Now, a different dimension of corruption, I'll say, in my point of view also is, if you have remuneration, which is very low, then you have, let me say, civil servants going into activities that amount to corruption. So I think these are internal problems countries or institutions should make sure they tackle. Then it takes me back to the SDG that talks about strong institutions. So that is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you also for underlining that this is a new element actually in the SDGs that was not addressed in the previous development framework. Last question here, and then I'll go back to
thank you, Tina from the EU delegation. I'll be really quick and summarize my question. And thank you so much to all the panelists and for waking us up with your rather provocative inputs. It makes it an interesting discussion. So in summary, my question is the role of transparency and how to engage multilaterally on increasing transparency. I'm thinking specifically of, illicit financial flows, country by country reporting, but also on corruption on a national level, regional level, just in general, how to engage countries like China, which are not big fans necessarily of transparency in a multilateral sphere, more on such issues.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go back to the panel, starting with Luis Alberto Moreno, and then Ambassador Fatima, Mohammed, and then Yuan. Questions, several questions relating to corruption. We certainly started an extremely lively discussion here. Should we consider grand corruption and state capture in a different way from petty corruption or extortion? How do we regulate multilateral corrupt and illegal actors? What are the methods of approaching that? What's the role of remuneration and transparency, such as common reporting standards? Questions on conditionality, questions on foreign investment and business and human rights, and questions on the fit for purpose nature of the AU for current challenges. I think one could make that more broadly of many of our institutions for current challenges. Luis Alberto Moreno, please.
Well, that's a pretty full set of questions. I'll try to be brief and give, of course, Ambassador Mohammed, and I know we're tight for time. Unfortunately, I have a 2:30. I have to go to something else. But
let me just ask each panelist not to answer every question, but to choose the two that you want to answer of those questions.
So I would just, step back and say the following. I think when you, first of all, on issues of corruption, you have always to be mindful of the sovereignty of the nation state. And, there are practices, there are legal workings within governments that are different from one to the other. So this notion of having something totally global on corruption, you can do a number of things that I would say are more on a voluntary basis. This is more than just, the machinery of the UN producing a, anti-corruption framework or whatever. I think it's more on the bearing on business. And, there's a number of initiatives that have happened here. There's one called PACHI, which a number of big corporations have signed on to. Getting more in that space is very important. But let's face it, if anything, what we're seeing in this very turbulent world that we live in is that the current system that we have has a lot of weaknesses. And that, to me, is one of the biggest challenges that we have coming out of everything that we've seen so far. And I think it's inherent on all countries to begin to address this very issue. In terms of what can we do from the perspective of a development bank, what I found that is the most effective way of dealing with many of these issues is through the financial channel. And when I say the financial channel is largely through the Ministry of Finance, because at the end of the day, financial transactions can be monitored and regulated in different ways, and you can see this. And there's been many successes, for instance, in things like money laundering, when you have specialized units that look at this, not only from the perspective of a finance ministry, but equally through the different, Attorney General's office or whatever the makeup of the organizations, legal organizations inside governments to track these kinds of crimes. So I think that is definitely fundamental. But we must not lose sight of another aspect, which is real and is very real for Latin America, and I'm sure for Africa is even deeper. And it's this notion of informality, of the so-called Black economy, or however you want to call it, where essentially things like drug trafficking happen totally outside the legal economy. And it is in that space where a lot of the problems that are created that fuel precisely this amount of corruption. And that's something that we have to reckon with. And of course, it goes deeper into the kind of labor laws countries have, how labor laws essentially sometimes help people be outside of the legal system, and how, essentially what you have is, if I'm contributing with a formal wage, I'm paying essentially for another person to be out, because the government has to provide the social services, the pensions, and the rest. So that is one of the biggest challenges. There is no quick solution to this. Many countries have tried different things, but in my view, I think more and more as these so-called universal basic income type of programs begin to take hold, is perhaps a thread under which you can begin to deal with this.
Thank you so much for that. Ambassador Fatima, Mohammed, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting conversation. And it's interesting how this whole kind of discussion has come round to the issue of corruption, and how it's such a big topic, and of course a big issue of concern. And I think at some point, maybe when we have more time, I'd love to explore this idea about corruption, the advantages of corruption, and how corruption can be good for a nation or even an economy, because I remain to be convinced. But perhaps what I can say in general terms, once again from an institutional perspective, is that the solutions that we need require both anti-corruption measures, but more importantly, institutional building support, both for our local and national institutions, but also our regional institutions. I think the point that Mr. Moreno made about the sovereignty of states is an important one, but I think there's also this interconnectivity, and we cannot move away from that, especially when we talk about addressing the issue of IFFs, because it doesn't happen in isolation. And therefore, we need to promote as much as possible a strong institutional and international frameworks that are ready to actually address and combat the challenges that are linked to IFFs. In addition to that, I can probably comfortably say that corruption also poses, I think, a significant challenge to domestic resource mobilization, which remains one of the biggest challenges for many of our countries on the continent. And we've taken some steps towards supporting, in partnership with the UN in particular, to support some of our countries in terms of how they can promote their fiscal space and also strengthen their capacity in terms of domestic resource mobilization. Of course, we have challenges in terms of just revenue collection and mobilizing governments in terms of understanding and having the means to be able to finance some of their development needs in order to ensure not only sustainable growth but overall state building. And I think the issue of lack of capacity prevents states from playing that effective role and enforcing, some of the laws and regulations that are required in order to address the issue of corruption in particular. Second point I want to make is just the issue of partnerships. And I think this was to a certain extent mentioned by the participant from the EU, and thank you for mentioning our trilateral cooperation with the UN as well. And I just wanted to make a point regarding how it is important that we continue to build on these kind of partnerships, not only in addressing our common challenges, but are ensuring that we build convergence and promote, cooperation across pillars. We talked earlier about, the issue of ownership, of even mutual accountability and respect for sovereign states, but also we have some international cross-cutting issues, right? For example, human rights, the issue of gender mainstreaming. I think these are fundamental for cooperation, and where there's a strong sense on the one hand of ownership from people who live in certain environments where they can operate and function and understand and see development actually happening. And also, on the other hand, promote cooperation where we can agree on some cross-cutting issues. We can build more partnerships that are sustainable in addressing our common issues. And this brings me to the issue of the SDGs, and I'll just say a last sentence on that because it was also raised. For us, in addition to the SDGs, we have Agenda 2063, and there are clear overlaps in terms of our development priorities, both globally and continentally, and we'll continue to work with our partners in terms of achieving these overall objectives. I'll stop here and thank you once again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador. And also, I think important to underline that the Common Africa position was very instrumental in agreeing the targets that relate, in fact, to corruption and institution building within the SDGs, with the parallel emphasis in Agenda 2063. I'm just, before going to Juan for a final item, just going to respond myself in terms of one of the questions, since I was asked to try to be a speaker and a moderator, and that's on the evidence regarding corruption. So just to say that this has been very interesting to me, the sort of richness and the frankness of this debate. But it is, I think, important to know that there is really pretty good evidence in quantitative terms, econometric evidence, that corruption has various types of damaging effects. So it results in lower growth on average. It results in shorter periods of growth. So lack of ability to sustain growth over periods. And for me, something in the realm I work, which is most interesting, it correlates with episodes of conflict very strongly. So countries with higher level of corruption are 30 to 45% more likely to fall into conflict than countries with lower levels of corruption. So, Yuan, I would be interested, as with Ambassador Mohammed, to continue this discussion, but I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to comment on the questions, and then we'll sum up.
Great, thank you. I will comment on two questions. One is a business and human rights, which really brought home for me, and the other is a conditionality. So on business and human rights, currently I'm working with UNDP China on evaluating Chinese legislations on business and human rights, which is a really interesting thing, and I can share with you some findings. On their overseas activity, Chinese companies' overseas activities, business and human rights, which basically applies to whether it applies to host country human rights. So starting from 2011 onwards, there are a growing trend of Chinese government legislation or policy or regulations, voluntary guidelines regarding business and human rights. Human rights is not explicitly used, but there are issues of ESG mentioned, unless before 2011, the focus was more on security of personnel and assets. And then the problem is it's very difficult to implement because companies go abroad, Chinese companies go abroad, and government can't get hold of them. Particularly among private-owned enterprises, they are massive in amount, and they don't even know about these regulations. The regulations are better known to the state-owned enterprises, which are connected to Chinese embassies. They have to report to Chinese embassies when they go abroad, and so that's why they are better regulated, but they are also big, visible, and better in terms of behavior. So the legislation is basically missing a huge chunk of the private-owned enterprises that are problematic. There is also an increasing trend of recognition of international standards. So we know that when companies operating in a multinational company's operation is subject to 3 types of standards. One is host country laws and regulations, one is home country laws and regulations, and third is international standards. And before around 2019, 2020, there isn't much formal recognition of international standards in Chinese laws of overseas activities, but starting from then on, there are gradually recognition of SDG, of business and human rights, UNGP, etc. And these are explicitly mentioned, but particularly on environment, less on labor and human rights. And again, human rights is not explicitly mentioned in any legislation, but an area missing is women and children, and they are just pretty much missing in the discussion. I hope those findings are helpful. Very quick comment on the conditionality. So there are political conditionality and economic conditionality, right? So this is the main difference, political conditionality, between Chinese and Western development finance. And China is known for not having any political conditionality except one China policy. But the West is known for having good governance and transparency behind their attached to their loans. But that's also why in 2004, Angola decided to go with China rather than IMF, because IMF insisted on transparency of their oil sector. So that's why they shifted to China. But in terms of economic conditionality, there isn't that much of a difference. One thing is that here is when African agency can come into the game. This is where people can negotiate. For instance, Exim Bank requires 70% of Chinese element in any loans it provides. But in the case of the standard gauge railway I mentioned in the beginning, opening remark, it's 40% of local content that Kenyan proposed as their major achievement of negotiation. So African agency can happen here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to just sum up very quickly. It's not going to be possible to do justice to such a very rich and sometimes controversial, which is excellent, discussion. But I'll just try to perhaps make 3 points. I think one is that we all talked on the panel about state building being nationally driven, needing to have models that are owned by societies and being, in essence, a sovereign issue. But we also talked about the positive role, potentially, of international norms. And I think that there was a lot of support there on the panel and around the room for what Ambassador Mohammed said about the movement, for example, from non-interference to non-indifference, and what that can do positively to encourage and give incentives to meet common norms. The second is that we talked about very, very different country situations and regional situations, and yet a series of common challenges. So challenges of capacity to deliver what citizens want from their states, challenges of managing growth, for instance, during rapid urbanization episodes, challenges of external competition and interests that may not always align with the development interests of countries in building their own institutions and social contracts, and challenges of corruption. I think that we also all spoke about the fragility of institutions, and I would say, since this is my own background, having worked on fragile states, that we increasingly see a world where no country and region can say that it has no fragility in institutions. There is fragility in institutions everywhere in comparison to the challenges that we face. And last, there was a really, really interesting conversation on corruption, with a lot of discussion about the role of grand corruption versus petty corruption, about the more sophisticated dynamics of state capture, which can be legal or illegal in their nature, about the role of international standards, transparency of the private sector, and conditionalities on transparency. And I would just say, in concluding, that I think that Yuan is very much right in the analysis she gave of that, but I would add that the experience of the World Bank and the IMF over decades, I think this would be true of the IADB, in looking at conditionality in programs, is that unless there is some national reform leadership, conditionality does not sustain over the long term. So we come back always to that question of alignment with national interests. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for a really vibrant discussion.